Hey there and welcome back. If you've checked the headlines or your phone lately, you've probably noticed that tariffs are once again the talk of the town. Yes, President Donald Trump is back in office, and with his return has come a whirlwind of new tariff announcements, global trade tensions, and plenty of debate. But what exactly is happening? And more importantly, how might it affect you? By the end of this video, you'll understand the basic concept of tariffs, why they've been making a massive comeback under the current administration, and why Europe and China have been lining up their own responses. Let's dive in. First off, let's tackle the simplest question. What is a tariff? A tariff is basically a tax that a government places on goods imported from another country. Imagine a company in the United States buying electronics from China. If there's a tariff on those electronics, let's say 10%, the US importer pays an extra 10% in tax on top of whatever they're already paying the Chinese supplier. That extra money goes to the government imposing the tariff. Governments use tariffs for a bunch of reasons. Sometimes it's to protect local businesses and jobs. After all, if foreign goods become pricier, buying domestic products might suddenly look more appealing. Other times, tariffs become political tools or bargaining chips. One country may say, "We'll hold off on tariffs if you buy more of our steel," or "We'll slash our tariffs if you open up your car market to our automakers." But it's a double-edged sword. If you impose tariffs on a country, don't be surprised if it imposes its own tariffs right back. That's how trade disputes escalate, and it can push up prices for all of us, companies and consumers alike. Now, tariffs aren't new. They've been around for centuries, popping up in everything from medieval guild protections to modern-day trade wars. However, they tend to grab headlines whenever major economies start clashing. And that's exactly what's happening right now. President Trump has introduced a raft of new tariffs, including a 10% baseline tariff on goods from virtually every country, except for China. For Beijing, it's much steeper. Some goods are now slapped with tariffs as high as 145%. That's huge. China, of course, retaliated by hitting American imports with tariffs of up to 125%. On top of that, certain US allies, like members of the EU, also found themselves on the worst offenders list, facing tariffs well above 10%. For a brief moment, the entire global economy seemed to teeter on the edge of a full-blown trade war. Then, in a sudden twist, Trump announced a temporary pause, a 90-day truce, if you will, for most of these higher tariffs, again, not including China. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, but the question is this just a break or a genuine change of direction? Before that pause, financial markets were in chaos. US stocks plunged. Some estimates say the S&P 500 fell nearly 13% in 1 week, wiping out trillions in market value. Iconic American companies that rely on global supply chains were hammered, and bankers started warning that a recession could be just around the corner. What really forced the administration's hand, though, wasn't just the stock market, it was the bond market. US government bonds, a safe haven in turbulent times, also took a hit. Typically, when stock prices drop, government bond prices go up. But in moments of extreme panic, both can fall together, which is exactly what started to happen. That's the sort of really bad scenario that can spark a larger financial crisis. The White House saw the writing on the wall, and President Trump abruptly announced a temporary truce for countries other than China. So, where does Europe fit into all this? The European Union, led by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, didn't just sit quietly. Initially, Brussels prepared a list of retaliatory tariffs worth around 21 billion euros, targeting sensitive US exports like Louisiana soybeans, whiskey, and more. They were essentially ready to slug back, but, also cautious, aiming for what they called a calm and measured response. A key meeting in Luxembourg saw EU Trade Chief Maros Sefcovic remind everyone that Europe was not going to escalate the situation unless forced. After the White House offered its 90-day pause, the EU decided to put its retaliatory measures on hold as well. Still, Europe's leaders are using this window to negotiate a better deal, whether it's about steel and aluminum, cars, or future energy investments. Of course, this doesn't mean everyone's off the hook indefinitely. If negotiations fall apart or if Trump suddenly changes his mind again, those retaliatory tariffs could be back on the table. In the meantime, the EU is trying to safeguard key industries and press the US for more favorable terms, especially on fossil fuels and digital services. If there's a central clash in this whole saga, it's between the world's two largest economies, China and the United States. Trump singled out China, imposing the highest rates, up to 145% on certain Chinese goods, and saying Beijing was ripping off the USA in trade deals. China fired back with tariffs of its own, going up to 125% on American products, including agricultural goods and high-value machinery. So why is Trump piling on China specifically? One reason is the long-standing trade imbalance. Last year the US imported far more from China than it exported. Add concerns about alleged intellectual property theft and forced technology transfers, and it's not surprising that tensions boiled over. The big question is whether this is now a more targeted trade war, with the rest of the world breathing easier, thanks to that 90-day pause, while Washington and Beijing duke it out. Meanwhile, a lot of people are worried that the US and China might decouple their supply chains altogether. Companies that once depended on Chinese factories for everything from electronics to car parts might start sourcing from other countries like Vietnam or Mexico. That could change how global trade works for years to come. So how might this affect you? Well, in short, expect prices to shift. Tariffs can make imported goods more expensive, and companies often pass those costs on to consumers. For example, if you're buying a phone that uses parts from China, the final price might go up. And if you work for a company that relies heavily on imported steel, your employer's costs could skyrocket, potentially affecting wages, hiring, or even job security. On the flip side, if you're in a domestic industry that competes with cheap imports, tariffs might give you a boost, at least at first. But here's the thing. Retaliatory tariffs can hurt other sectors that need to export their products. It's a trade-off that doesn't always yield the straightforward protection people hope for. Another twist is that the United States is pushing the European Union to buy more American fossil fuels, partly to balance out trade, partly to lessen Europe's reliance on other energy sources. The talks have been, well, complicated, and some European diplomats feel that the US isn't all that eager to finalize a deal, especially while it holds the tariff threat over Europe's head. Then there's tech. The EU has been developing stricter regulations under its Digital Markets Act, which could mean hefty fines for big American tech companies like Apple or Meta. But with so much at stake on the trade front, some in Brussels are wondering if it's better to hold off on punishing these companies for now, just to avoid another meltdown in US-EU relations. It's a messy, overlapping chessboard, and each player is jockeying for leverage. Across Europe, individual countries are scrambling. Germany's newly elected Chancellor Friedrich Merz has promised to reinvigorate his country's export-driven economy, which is under major threat from these tariffs. He supports a tough EU-wide response but also calls for a transatlantic free trade agreement. He's trying to show German voters he can defend their economic interests while avoiding a damaging trade war with the United States. France's President Emmanuel Macron, meanwhile, has been vocal about the need for a united European front. Although France faces its own set of crises at home, Macron is pushing for what he calls a more muscular response if negotiations break down. He's also hinted that European companies might pause investments in the US until the tariff situation becomes clearer. On the other side of the channel, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has been treading carefully, refusing to criticize Trump too harshly while he tries to secure a trade deal for the United Kingdom. Since Britain is no longer in the EU, it's on its own to negotiate with Washington, but it still faces the baseline 10% on most goods, plus specific tariffs on steel and automobiles. London hopes the White House will soften these sectoral tariffs, but honestly there are no guarantees. So there you have it, a world in flux over tariffs. And not for the first time. With President Trump back in office, the United States has unleashed a wave of new taxes on imports, sparking a fierce back and forth with China and leaving Europe and other American allies to scramble for Plan B. The temporary 90-day pause might give everyone time to negotiate, but no one really knows if it'll hold, or if we're just postponing the inevitable. In the meantime, keep an eye on those price tags if you're buying anything that relies heavily on global supply chains. Tariffs can take a while to trickle down, but they eventually show up in the store or in your online shopping cart. And for policymakers, the clock is ticking. Unless a more permanent deal can be struck, we could be right back on the brink of another global trade crisis. If you found this video helpful, be sure to like and subscribe. We'll keep you posted on all the twists and turns in this evolving trade story. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.